were talking. Apologies. Oh, I'll just pause for a minute while I don't hear my echo. Right, good morning. Oh. Testing. Testing. There we go. Good. Right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Guildford and Waverley Joint Governance Committee. Can I have apologies for absence and notifications of substitutes? Kissy.
I've only had apologies from Councillor Bigmore.
With no substitutions, just to confirm?
No, no substitutions.
Okay, right, fine. Disclosures of interest, anyone? Seeing none, then moving to item 3, adoption of the minutes of the previous meeting. Can I have your approval to agree the minutes from the 1st of November 2023? My apologies, Peter. Yes.
Thank you, Leader. Can I just, I'm sorry, I'm not usually picky with the minutes, but at the bottom of page 5 of the agenda papers, or page 3 of the actual minutes, the very bottom there, it says Tom Horwood, Joint Chief Executive, addressed the committee and confirmed to the committee that the joint management team was not paid for by GBC, however, the weighted balance of tasks was not equally balanced either. I have to say, I don't quite understand that sentence, and it probably just needs to be amended slightly, but that maybe could be done afterwards.
I think the distinction is that the joint management team is employed by Waverley. So technically speaking, they're not paid by GBC, they're paid by WBC, but then it's recharged through a variety of mechanics, Ian.
Okay, that's a nuance that actually hadn't occurred to me. Right, thank you for that clarification.
Thank you, Chair. Part of that would also be that not all of the joint management team is 50-50 weighted in terms of costing. There are some members of that team that are more weighted in one direction than the other. For example, the director of place is, I believe it's 60-40 paid for by Guildford, which reflects the weight.
I was thinking for a moment you were all volunteers, and I was just going to say how grateful we are to you. But
thank you.
Any further comments on the minutes? Are we all good to approve them then? Thank you. Bear with me one moment. And then moving on to item 4, the Joint Risk Register, the task group report. Can I first of all say thank you to Yasmin, Robin and everybody else who's worked on getting this in order, for listening to the obviously intensely interesting discussions of 2 times 2 hour debates of the task and finish group that we established on this, and equally thank you to the members of that task and finish group for taking the time to go through that. You have in front of you the output of that group with the revised risks. I'm not proposing to go through them line by line, as some of us here have done that rather a lot to get to this point in the first place. So I'm going to just invite any other comments or suggestions, changes to the risks, anything that anybody wants to flag. Peter.
Thank you. Could I also say thank you very much for a very good piece of work although I was a bit squinty-eyed looking at the proposed bits, especially when I printed it down. I practically needed a microscope to look at it. And maybe in the future we could have A3 printed stuff sent to us, because it would make it a whole lot easier. I struggled at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon in my study. But can I also say thank you for the really excellent little glossary of terms. I've been around this council for 17 or 18 years, and I still don't know what half the pseudonyms are, and I have to think, and I usually get there in the end, but having that was really useful. So thank you very much for that. So that was really good. Can I just go through 1 or 2 points and I hope that I'm not going to be overly zealous on this, but could I just go to old risk number 5? And if you look at old risk number 5, this is to do with there is a risk that the JMT resource will not be apportioned fairly. And that was rated red by this committee at its last deliberation. And it seems to me that this has really gone to new risk 3. New risk 3 says there is a risk collaboration will not be brackets legally and financially fair, and it maybe falls into 4 as well. I just wonder whether it needs to be beefed up to include the JMT and staff resource not being apportioned fairly. If you look at the new risk 3, it just says there is a risk collaboration will not be fair, and new risk 4, there is a risk collaboration will be perceived as unfair for councillors, staff and residents. The old risk was that JMT resource was not deployed fairly, and that seems to have gone. Where do I find that in the new risk register?
So in this, it was consolidated into that risk. So if you go into the examples of risk, it's part of the resources from joint officers. So we obviously can't in the joint register account for issues of unfairness with officers that solely work for each one of the councils separately, but risk 3, new risk 3 accounts for the resources of joint officers. Also, as the risk is, there is a risk collaboration will not be legally and financially fair. I interpreted that as coming under the legal aspects of it, but also the finance aspects of it too, because if we're not getting what we paid for, it wouldn't be financially fair. And if they weren't working in the way that we'd written in the inter-authority agreement, it wouldn't be legally fair.
So, Chairman, where do I see reference in your mitigations or anywhere else to joint management team or staff resource not then being apportioned fairly, other than at a very general level in the way that you've just outlined?
Well, so in the current measures, the cost sharing protocols are agreed. So we have a governance structure for setting out what is considered fair. And as Ian mentioned a moment ago, there are a couple of instances where we have already determined that a 50-50 split is not the fair share. There are a few where it's weighted the other way. In terms of the plans going forward, really what we need this committee to do is weigh in where they don't think things are fair, with evidence and examples of issues that they're bringing forward. I mean, what I'm keen to avoid, and I think probably Julia's in the same boat here as well, is members in general just saying things aren't fair without any kind of evidence to back that up. Because where there is evidence, we will need to address it and thoroughly and properly. But actually, I think the other thing I'll just repeat from a meeting I said at our full council was that sometimes events will temporarily skew things in one way or another, and that's entirely reasonable. And they have done at Waverley on occasion, and without going into too much detail, they certainly have at Guildford on occasion. So, any further comments on this, Peter?
Well, I've got several points, not just on this one, but I've got a concern on that. To a degree, my next point is a little similar. If we go to old risk 8, there is a risk that officer capacity will be overstretched during the transition, and this was rated red again last time. And as far as I can see, the nearest that we get to that into the new risks is in new risk 5. There is a risk which is described as there is a risk service delivery / pre-existing work suffers due to pressure pressures associated with collaboration. So I'm struggling to read the print here. I'm not convinced that this, again, this officer capacity and stretched business is quite well enough captured in that. Maybe I have to, I just feel that it's been downplayed a bit. Again, it's a bit like the previous point.
So where we'd consolidated risks together because they were too interrelated in that way, we put in the examples of risk, the types of things that might be the way that the organisation sees that, and it is the top example of that risk of how it might actually impact. So from my point of view, it's very much covered. What we had in the old version of this register was too many either duplicated or overlapping risks where we were looking at one aspect of something rather than it as a whole. What we've tried to do here is take an overarching risk and then give clear examples of where we've done that. And in practice, what that's meant is the consolidated, the pre-existing risks we had consolidated into the new one. You can usually see them expressed in the examples of risk.
Okay. Sorry, yes, I accept, I did note the fact that in the first example you gave that. So that's and therefore I feel a little relaxed on that one. Okay, if I can then go to old risk number 11, please, which again was red rated last time. And this is where there is a risk that one council's priorities will dominate for a period. And as I'm not sure where this is covered or where this might be covered in the new set of risks, except in the more general way in which you've just described in the previous two examples. Is that where we go to?
Well, I would exactly argue that it's covered under risk 3, that there is a risk that the collaboration will not be legally and financially fair. And there will, and I will stress this, there are moments where one council will need more resource than the other for a particular event. Where I think we'd see I think the more obvious version of that would be if one council's corporate strategy versus another, and one was clearly dominating the other, which I think would be unacceptable to both councils pretty much straight away. Where it's more likely a problem is where we don't see a large amount of resource going to somewhere else because of an event that might not be so obvious. So, for example, Waverley's legal has had to use resource from Guildford's legal, I gather, because we've been under-resourced in our legal function, and equally for various reasons, finance resource from Waverley has been used to help Guildford. So from my point of view, there's always been swings and roundabouts, frankly, when it comes to the deployment of resource. It's only when it's considered unfair, either legally or financially, as the risk articulates, that it is a matter for discussion. So really, it's about the mechanics of raising those concerns and how they're addressed with evidence. And that risk is where we're seeking to do that.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I am in favour of the 28 risks going down to 17. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I think to have that number of risks before was inappropriate. So, and I realise some risks are going to suffer to a degree. And I think for me, those three have suffered a bit in terms of the focus. If I go on, then I think many of the other areas, I think the financial risks are fine compared new and old, and I think there are other areas which are okay. But where I think I have the most concern is that in the new risks there is very little, or if any, consideration of IT risk. And in the existing risks, we have risk number 17 and risk number 27, both of which were red rated by us at the last meeting. They've effectively gone into new 11 and 12, but don't get much of a mention. And I think John Rabini mentioned last time how important IT is, and we read all sorts of difficulties with authorities around the country with IT risks and problems. And it just seems to me an extremely significant risk. And if we do try and bring our systems together, that's writ large with difficulty. And I don't think it's sufficiently covered. And I would like to see it beefed up if it can be.
I'm just having another skim through, and I mean, it wouldn't be a proper risk register if you didn't need a magnifying glass at some point, which is what I probably need right now. So we do cover in risk 10 a reference to IT in terms of effective and efficient IT solutions cannot be afforded. But I think you're probably right in that there isn't anything that, unless Yasmin, you know where it is, that talks about if an attempted IT integration fails or causes significant costs or detriment to service. I don't know if we've accounted for that aspect of it in any of the risks.
No, I think you're right. I don't think it's necessarily in the wider collaboration risk register. Obviously, that would be included in all the risk registers for the different projects. And when we're looking at systems and IT, considering change to IC systems, that would be a major one in those risk registers. But if the committee believes it's a threat to the programme more widely and collaboration more widely, then obviously it's up to committee to add something in. Be happy to do that.
And I think it would be a flavour on risk 6 as a potential risk outcome for sure, which is there is a risk non-collaborative projects and programmes of the council, of either councils, could suffer due to collaborative efforts. So I would class that as even IT project causes a failure. I think that's one expression of the risk, not the only one, but one expression of the risk.
Chairman,
And the other one is
I really think that IT risk is such a big potential problem that it has to be it has to be mentioned very specifically, in my view. And I think I just think an indirect reference to IT is inadequate. I think it has to be much more direct.
The issue that came up in the committee, and certainly has come up in the Waverley Executive, is that when you look at IT, you're not looking at one holistic package for the whole council doing everything. You're doing it service area by service area. So when it comes to doing service level integrations within the collaboration, because that's hopefully where we'll get to next, that is almost always where you'd see the IT risk expressed for that particular area. So we did roll it up into the sort of general collaboration risk. I think we probably do need to be more explicit that IT is a principal financial risk in that equation, though, Yasmin.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're sort of developing risk, we go through the process of thinking there is a risk that, what is it that we're expecting to materialise and what the consequence would be. So I suppose my question would be, is that about the specificity of those two things, what the risk exactly would read and the consequence. Very happy to put it in, but it's just sort of working that through as to what we want to really bring out in that risk. What are we trying to bring out and mitigate?
Because there are, I mean, other than the impact on existing or new programs, there's also one of the main reasons that we'd go for IT integration is to make savings. So there would be a risk along the lines of risk 9 that any savings didn't make the financial savings that we wanted them to be. So I think we've got covered in various elements. What happens if collaboration doesn't achieve savings? And IT is one of them. We've got what happens if we don't do it, or we have an inefficiency. What we haven't got is if there's any particular excessive cost in IT integration, or if it causes a massive service issue. And I just don't know where they would go. I mean, can I just ask the committee in general, unless the committee is asking for a specifically expressed IT risk, at which point I will be asking you for a cost and a significance and what is the general cost to collaboration of IT, because we'd have to scope that out to do a proper risk on the subject.
Chairman, I understand the point, but all I'm saying is that IT integration is a hot topic, and you're right. It's not one project; it's a number of projects. But we all know that IT risk is very great, and whenever you fiddle around with IT systems and bring them together or scrap them and have a new system in whatever area, we know it's fraught. And if what I might suggest, either in 11 or 12, under examples of risk, could we place the IT risk in some shape or form? It may not, perhaps we don't need a separate risk, but I just think it needs to be given as an example of risk. And I think, in my view, it's one of the most significant examples of risk and difficulties that we may have in the systems area. And so, I would be grateful if that could be done. Yeah,
so risk 11, I've no objection if nobody else does to articulating IT a little bit more than there. I mean, that risk does talk about the inefficiencies of using different platforms. And I think the other part of that that we could probably articulate is that if we do attempt to integrate IT, it may cause issues as well. There are actual integration, if it goes wrong, can cause different types of issues than it not happening at all. So we can articulate both of those in risk 11. Is everybody comfortable with the actual impacts on risk 11? Because what we're saying at the moment is, in our current state, IT is a significant issue for both councils and for the collaboration. There are lots of different reasons why that is. But it then goes to effectively critical if we're doing something more real on the subject in terms of integrating it. And I think, I imagine most of you will agree that IT integration is definitely going to be a critical risk for both councils, because it could easily go very wrong. Ian, before I bring anybody else.
Chairman, if I may interject at that point, I agree with that, but it's just that in the old register, both risk 17 and risk 27, which dealt with the IT area, were both red rated. And when you come and now look at the new 11 and 12, they're now amber rated. And I would then say, I think and I think that's partly to do with IT. I just think that there's something wrong there. We haven't quite got that right. And I just think we probably need under 11, if it was red rated a few weeks ago, why isn't it red rated now? And if it's the removal of IT and other things, then I have a big concern.
I mean, largely some of the reasons why some things were red rated before and are not red rated now is because the threshold for the scoring was reevaluated as part of the risk group's work, because it was deemed in the values were not appropriate, were they, if I recall?
Sorry, I thought you meant change the scoring as in change the ratings. So when they were consolidated, I think when they were consolidated by the task and finish group, that was the point at which we took a fresh look and said, this risk as it now has been agreed, what should the ratings be? But I think it's an important point that you make, Councillor Martin, as to we can do an exercise of looking at the other risks, so the previous risks where they've been consolidated and what the differences in those ratings have been, and just make sure that we've got that solid and articulated reason as to why that is. And if we're bringing in the detail that we've just talked about as well into those specific risks 11 and 12, then we could do that beforehand and then take that review as to the scoring. I'd be happy to do that.
Chairman, I'd be very happy with that. I'm just unhappy that two things which were red have now been assembled in a different way, and suddenly it's all gone away, and that raises sort of a little concern to me.
I think the other thing I would just flag before I bring in Meryl, because she's been waiting for ages, is that this is a new committee versus the previous one. And the previous one's risk appetite was different. Is the other reason why some of these may have changed. Yeah, okay. Meryl and then John.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for being late this morning. I just wanted to come back to new risk number 3 and how are we going to define fair from a practical point of view? Is there going to be a timeline? If one of the councils use more resources than the other one in all aspects, is that going to be given back as almost like a time off in lieu where things get cross-referenced? Is it going to be financial? And is it going to be a timeline? And if that's a very long timeline, are we thinking about what happens if we do this in hindsight? If all resources or lots of resources are used at one council, will there be an effect on services in the other council?
So where we're taking fairness from as a starting point is the inter-authority agreements between both councils, which defines how costs and other services and resources are shared as a default. So certainly from my point of view, and if anybody's got a different view on this, please do shout, because it's definitely the time to do it. If things are deviating materially from the inter-authority agreement, and we've got evidence to show that's the case, it should probably be brought here to discuss, and probably to each executive as well, which is where it will almost certainly end up as well. There will now and again, as I said, be events that draw temporarily from one to another, and in some cases they will balance out or not, and that's probably something that certainly the executive over here is, when those sorts of things come up, we discuss it, and the exec heads of service talk to their portfolio holders about those sorts of things when it happens. But from my point of view, legally and financially fair is what is stated in the inter-authority agreement. And if we're deviating from that materially, this committee should discuss it. Well, to be fair, that is a good question. I know in our case, the portfolio holders would discuss those sorts of things with their exec heads. I'm assuming the same thing would happen in Guildford as well. I would almost certainly be consulted if there was going to be a very large deviation. So, for example, if somebody said almost all of the Waverley finance team are going to go and help Guildford for a period of 3 months, they'd probably come and ask me about that. And it certainly wouldn't happen in that level of extreme anyway. So I think we would get appropriate advice through both executives to get that. And if not, it would need to come here. But I think we need to have that mechanic of bringing issues with the inter-authority agreement here. I think it's one of the roles of this committee is to review and be the sort of oversight to the inter-authority agreement. At some point, there probably has to be a discussion about joint scrutiny, because the more things that move over to the collaboration, the more things probably need to go through a more formal scrutiny process. And that's subject to another discussion at the Joint Governance Committee. No, what's it called? The standards one. I've forgotten what its name is, but the other one. Yes, so it's Standards General Purposes Committee's joint little subgroup, isn't it? It's not the Joint Constitution Review Group. There we go. See, I need my glossary.
You love your subgroups.
I do love my subgroups. It's where the work happens. Anything else, Meryl? No. John?
Yes, thank you, Paul. So I'm just going to support the IT change. My problem is very similar to Councillor Martin's, that if you look at IT under the old risks, they were all basically red. There was a common thread through at least 5 of those risks, all mentioning IT. So it is very important. So when we say here under 10 for the collaboration, we talk about efficient IT solutions cannot be afforded. Now, to me, if that's the case, surely isn't that more a red than an orange? I'm concerned that it hasn't rated enough to actually say we need IT properly costed, done, and I think it's a large risk if we don't get it done. So I prefer to see some red for IT.
So in some cases, we've been trying not to make the assumption that we always need to integrate IT, and we certainly don't need to do it all at once. The way this is likely to work when we start getting into the phase where we're looking at any service line integration. So let's just say, for example, that we wanted to integrate the planning teams of the two councils. The planning departments use a number of pieces of software. Sometimes they're the same as what Guildford use, but a different version, and sometimes they're wildly different completely. So there would be, at that point, as part of the business case for that integration, an IT plan to say whether we should integrate them, whether we can integrate them, because sometimes it's very difficult just on a data and structure side, and whether it's financially feasible to do so. I'm hoping the changes to the risk on IT that's been proposed will cover that, and it will obviously be a bit higher rated going forward in terms of what it is. But almost always this will be done on a service by service area rather than the whole council as a whole. John, and I'll bring in Ian.
If my second point is again a thread that came through, which I mentioned last time, and that's communication. I'm still concerned that our communication team are taking on an awful lot of work. I'm not sure how we're going to spread it out through. Yes, we need the councillors to spread it, etc., etc. But I am concerned that the public, especially in my area, for example, are still not getting much in the way of publicity about the collaboration. So I'd like to see the plan for communication forwarded so that we can start and get on with it and give it more publicity, please.
I think one of the things you've highlighted there is that the collaboration itself doesn't have a comms plan. So, I mean, there is a risk in terms of ability for the team's capacity. So, I mean, as part of the general risk on capacity of the joint teams to do anything, there is definitely a capacity risk in the comms team, which is partly being remedied because there's at least one relatively new starter, if not 2, because I think there's another one at Guildford. So some of the capacity is being dealt with in that specific team. The bit I think I want to just clock for an action, perhaps, is that the collaboration itself doesn't have a comms plan to tell people outside of the council what we're actually doing, probably not actually inside the council that well either. So we'll take that as an action and follow that one up.
Yes, thank you. Both those 2 points would satisfy me if we could, please.
In fact, I'll have a chat with Julia afterwards, and we'll see if we can add that to the agenda for the next one of these to talk about properly, and we'll bring the comms team along to have that discussion because it's probably a bit overdue anyway. Okay. Yes, please, and yeah, we'll add that to our so we'll add that to the resolution at the end of the discussion on risk. We'll put that down as an extra action to resolve. So there'll be one about amending the IT risk and one about comms plan and bringing the comms team in. Ian, did you want to add anything?
Thank you, Chair. Just picking up on the IT risk, we discussed this a lot, and there's always that temptation to use that broad term IT. There's actually a lot of issues here. And the real risk for me is that the cost and feasibility of combining systems on the service by service basis limits the amount of money that we save and the effectiveness of the collaboration, because it's costed out. It doesn't, it makes the whole thing very difficult to bring together. You've got things like telephone systems as well, and things like customer services. All those things need to be considered, and you are looking at probably a service by service basis to do that. But there are broader issues. There are things like the famous Zoom and Teams and the Microsoft licenses and all those sorts of things that need to be considered. So we're starting to unpick those things, but you're right. It is one of the main areas, along with the terms and conditions, that really are the foundation of what this collaboration is going to look like going forward for me.
And I'll just add to that, I think you highlighted it really in one of the other areas you're talking about there. Although there is service level IT, there is also this sort of enabling layer, which includes things like email and internal communications, Zoom, Teams, all of that layer. That is the layer that most concerns me at the moment, because it impacts everybody from members to officers, particularly joint officers. They've got 2 email accounts, 2 sets of different systems. For any of you that are double or triple hatters, you'll know how irritating it is to be going between different things. I find when I log into my Surrey stuff, it immediately kills any access to my Waverley stuff, which is always a treat. Some of our officers are going through that kind of thing every day at the moment with 2 lots of everything. So that enabling layer, completely separate to, very bespoke software in, say, housing or planning, that layer is the bit that is definitely first up and is probably causing the most issues at the moment. And we need to deal with that probably first. Right. Any other comments on any of the other risks before I go to the resolutions and the 2 we're going to add, Peter?
Sorry, it's not a question of the risks. It's a question of the structure on the right-hand side of the chart. Could I go back and ask some basic questions? And really, I could equally well have asked these questions of the old system. I think the old columns at the right-hand side were absolutely absurd, and I really don't understand them. Well, yes, I won't seek to defend my predecessor, but could somebody explain to me? I understand the current impact and the rating. What do we really mean when we get to residual impact, and how do we rate the residual rating? What do we, aren't we trying to? So when we get to a red in the current and residual, does that mean as we go forward? Because ultimately we want to eliminate it altogether. So there ought to be a timetable to it, and I don't understand the right-hand column, the further right-hand columns. Could somebody explain them to me?
I always use an absurd example in my day job to demonstrate what residual risk really means, and that's terrorism. So if you're a corporate entity and you've got a risk of terrorism, there are only so many things that you can legitimately do to mitigate that risk as a company. So there will always be, whatever actions you take, a residual risk at the end, because you can't eliminate the issue completely. Another way of rephrasing residual risk would be accepted risk or risk appetite. So we're at that point concluding that we will not be able to eliminate the risk, because in some cases you cannot eliminate the risk, or if you can, sometimes the extra cost of the mitigations to bring it down to absolute zero are too high. So there is a point where you accept the risk, either because you have to, because you can't, or because you don't want to do any more. It's got to a point you can tolerate. So the residual risk is going to be high. Now for us, for example, on IT, you could do all the IT changes in the whole council, all of them, and they could all be perfect. But unless IT stops, society doesn't change and nothing moves, the risk will always be there that further IT changes will be a problem. So for IT, for example, the residual risk will almost always be quite high because society won't stand still. So it is about what risks we tolerate, what our risk appetite is. And that is also why some of the ratings changed between the previous council and this one, because the risk appetite of the council has changed between this council and the last one. So when we're talking about the residual risk, it's what are we tolerating or what are we being forced to tolerate as a result of circumstances? What's left even after we've done everything else? And if there are things that you can think of that would still mitigate it down further, they need to be added to the mitigation list so we can score them and how much they will reduce it by further. Yasmin, you probably want to come in there too.
Thank you. Yeah, just on that point, I think we talked about this quite a lot at the Task and Finish group. And in terms of trying to come up with mitigations to mitigate the risks, the important thing is that difference, as you say. So the residual is a score that and the current thinking that we wouldn't be able to change that. That's that sort of that risk that you've described there, Councillor Follows. The important thing is the difference between the overall current score and the residual one. And if they don't match, then what mitigations are in place, which ones are current, which ones are planned, and do we need to add any further mitigations? So it's kind of it's a formula of looking at the sort of the three columns together to work out whether the mitigations are quite covering and doing what we need them to do.
I mean, I should probably add the usual caveat that risk is an entirely pseudoscience with an immense quantity of guesswork in there. It is not absolutely guaranteed, Peter.
Yeah, I sort of understand that. And I can accept that, I suppose, with risk number 7, which is the carbon target by 2030, because I don't think we're ever going to get to that. And therefore, the residual risk at red makes perfect sense to me. I don't want to get into a discussion about the carbon thing, but when I get to risk number 9, the expected collaboration savings cannot be realised, and then risk number 14, there's similarly, and risk number 17. There was risk number 7 and number 9. Sorry, continue on at red in the residual, and that I'm not getting doing this very well. 7 I've dealt with. When we get to red risk number 9 and also red risk number 4, we continue with a residual red, and I worry about a continual residual red. That seems to me too extreme. We ought to be able to do something about it.
I'm going to try and make this not too political, but in a universe where we can only plan 1 year to another, there is no way that we can plan for things to be better without better information every year. So I would never support a reduction in the risk on that until somebody gives me 5 years worth of budget planning in advance from the state.
Chairman, let us not go down that route if you may. All right. Otherwise, we'll be here all day. Therefore, I understand the residual risk a little better than I did, I suppose. My final point was on page 32, and that is with the change of the impact scores and the financials. Why, if we only a short time ago, we were talking about devastating being something with more than 500,000, we are now only not very much further down the line. We're now saying it's over 1 million. Why? Those are pretty big changes. And I would quite like to hear the justification for that.
A couple of justifications for that. Firstly, we were using quite an old methodology on this, and generally £500,000 for each council is not devastating. 1 million is. £500,000 can usually be absorbed somewhere, not without pain or not without issues.
I should remember that.
Oh yeah, but it can be absorbed, whereas 1 million, certainly more than once, becomes much more problematic. I mean, Yasmin, did you want to add anything to the scoring?
Not really. And it was something that was talked a lot about at the Task and Finish group. And as you say, it's not really a risk, is sort of that mixture between the art and the science of it. So it was more about what feels right instinctually. And then I think there was a bit of maths in terms of what would be devastating for each, and then timesing that by 2 because it's a joint risk register. I think that was some of the thinking as well.
Yes, because of course with the joint one, it's 1 million across the 2 councils, so 500,000 effectively for each. I mean, I feel like I'm going to be having a parallel version of this discussion with about the key decision threshold tonight.
Well, Chairman, if I may, the other thing is is that at an individual risk element, or when you accumulate risks and they come to considerably more than £1 million, but they're lost because it's spread over several risks, then what happens?
It's costed per line. Because I mean,
I think that's a weakness.
Now, there are some methodologies for amalgamating a risk register to make those kind of statements, but they are, in my opinion, somewhat dubious. I'm happy to send those to Yasmin so she can have a look at them, but I mean, you basically, once you start summing up things that are also guesses and based on mitigations that are guesses, you may as well just crack out your crystal ball at the bottom. So, yes, did you want to add anything to that?
I think whilst it would be an interesting exercise, it would be difficult. It'd be difficult, which isn't a reason not to do it. But I just would want to make sure we're clear on what value it would be, and just make sure before we put the time into it that we have a clear sort of.
So broadly,
right.
broadly, what you'd be doing is multiplying up the various values, dividing it by the number of risks, and coming out with a sort of average risk score for the entire register. Now, it would say something. Mathematically, you can generate that, obviously, but at the same time, would it actually add any particular value? Because, of course, the sum total of the risk would be, I mean, if everything was devastating, so therefore could theoretically have a maximum of 1 million, and we have got, 20 risks or so, then, you're looking at a sum total of a big number. But what does it add? There's also a point where you're multiplying up different guesses to get a big guess. And at what point is it?
Chairman, I
Really
think I do understand that, but 6 risks at 750,000 wouldn't occur as devastating, whereas accumulated they would. So I don't want to make a big thing of it, but I think we just need to be aware. In total, there's almost a sort of, we've got 17 risks. There's almost an assessment of the overall risk when we add it all together, without labouring it and going too stupid about it. But I think it's a point worth making.
I would suggest if that's done, it be done as a narrative statement rather than as a calculation.
I think that will be fine.
Because it's usually better with context explained.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, and it could also be based on the likelihood that we're judging at the moment, perhaps, rather than sort of taking risks that need to be on there but aren't very likely to be materialised, and that's what's been agreed by the committee. Perhaps we have a threshold as to we think these ones are relatively likely, and therefore we'll go into the maths, and that would make that number a bit more valuable and a bit worth more.
Right. Have any other hands? Meryl, I think. Yes.
I think this has sort of already been answered. I was just going to ask how you're going to quantify. No, I know, but do you give that room? Is there financial room for that?
So,
But they will still happen.
They will, and so when we have new risks effectively identified, the process will be that we'll discuss them here. So if there are risks that are coming out through the two councils themselves that are collaboration risks, they'll come up through. The mechanics of this should be, and I know this doesn't work quite properly yet, certainly it doesn't at Waverley, is that there is a risk register for Waverley and a risk register for Guildford. That's the top level register for those two councils. If there are areas that are collaboration risks, they come here. So if there are risks, there should be collaboration risks identified through the two councils, through the joint management team, through either executive, and as a backstop here where they're discussed and added to this register. We haven't yet had the process whereby we've identified a new risk that we haven't thought about on here to bring to this committee. So we probably just need to have a think about that in terms of how we do it.
Just to check then, my understanding, so a mechanism, so once those unknown unknowns become known unknowns, then the mechanism for how they get brought here, is that what you're referring to?
Without going into the whole Colin Powell territory that we were nearly going down there, I think it is just a case of how do we identify and articulate new risks? Yeah? Okay. That's, I think, where we're going with that, yeah? Right, any further hands? No, Victoria.
Sorry, just off that conversation, I've just noticed on risk number 4 on the new register, there doesn't seem to be any link back to any original risks. Does that mean that was a new one, or does that mean we've just kind of missed off the?
That was when I'll check, but I think that was when in the task and finish group it was decided that we would split a risk. I'd need to double check the detail, but that's what the memories that are coming back to me is that the different types of unfairness and how we need to split those out. So I think it had been an original risk, but then we thought actually it'd be clearer and better to have them separated, but I can check that.
Yeah, that was accommodating the fact that perceptions are sometimes not based in evidence, and it should be split off from the one that was specifically based in evidence, so it didn't taint it. Yeah, Victoria.
No, that's great. I knew you'd know the answer, Yasmin. Thank you. I just wanted to add my thanks on the record to Yasmin and Grace and Robin, and also all the members of the Task and Finish group, and indeed everyone that's made comments today, because I think what we have here is a very much improved register that we can all work with going forward. So thank you all.
No, well said. Thank you. Right, any further comments before I just add 2 recommendations to the end to account for what we've discussed? So we've obviously got the recommendations 2.1 through 3 in front of you. I'm proposing to add 2.4, which is to modify the IT risks in the way that we've discussed, and Yasmin will bring back that line for next time. And 2.5, which is to invite the comms team, the joint elements of the comms team, to come here to discuss an internal and external communications plan for the collaboration so that we can start developing and rolling that out. Any further comments, issues on those recommendations before I bring them to a vote? Nope, I'll take them all together. Can I have all those in favour of the recommendations 2.1 through 5, please show. That is unanimous. Thank you, everyone. There is no further formal business on the agenda, so I'll close the meeting down at 10:19. There is, of course, an informal briefing that will follow in the room. Thank you, everyone.